Great, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Amlung, as was mentioned in the introductions, and we are actually going to have John Payne kick us off to get us started with this discussion. John, can you hear us?
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. Good to be here. And excited to get to talk with you a little bit about terminology services and the Open Concept Lab today. And we have just a few different items that we are hoping to talk through. We've had the privilege of getting to work alongside and learn alongside many of you here and a number of countries as they're starting to set up their own infrastructure to support data exchange. And inevitably, one of the big things that countries start to face as their data sharing infrastructures grow is the need to normalize their data so that you can use data that's collected at the point of care for a lot of other secondary purposes. And terminology is a fundamental enabler of that data use and data exchange. And so what we want to talk through today is a little bit about some examples of how terminology is being used, what we've learned in that process, and specifically tooling that enables the use of that terminology. So you've all probably seen the OpenHIE architecture, and terminology services is one of the components. Like we said, in our experience, most countries, most organizations that are beginning to implement the OpenHIE architecture are starting with other components. And so it tends to be some of the other registry services like client or facility registries or an interoperability layer, such as OpenHIM. And terminology services tends to be an item that you start facing once you need it. And once you feel the pain of not having standardized terminology throughout your architecture, then you start to realize, okay, where do we start? How do we begin this? And so let's just talk through, what is the terminology service? How are people using it? How does it help? And so the terminology service is the location where you would central source for publishing your standards and definitions, terminologies, and in your architecture and making them available. So what does that mean to actually use that in your architecture then? So first, what is being published? The terminology is the standard language that people and systems use to communicate health data. There's a lot of different examples of this that are managed internationally, so like the ICD-10, ICD-11. You have examples like HL7 terminology sets, like could be gender codes, male, female, other LOINC for laboratory codes. There's a number of other examples. There's a lot of local terminology systems that are being developed as well. And so countries tend to establish something like a national health data dictionary where they are establishing standards just that are being used within the country. And that often is some locally developed code systems, but also subsets of internationally recognized code systems. And the terminology service then is the single source of truth where you publish these codes for your data sharing architecture. And why would you do that? One is you need a way to make it easy for anything that's in your health information exchange to access those codes and to use them, and to do so in a standards-based way. And second is you, like we talked about for data that's being collected at the point of service, that you want to be able to use that in a lot of other for use cases and for secondary use cases. And that requires that you can validate those codes, that you know that they are part of a standard code system that you're interested in, that you might be cleaning that data before you push it into a data warehouse where you're going to do data analytics. And so you need to normalize that data against your published standards. So terminology services is a architectural component that enables you to do this. What's that actually mean? There are a handful of functions that a terminology service typically provides. And at an atomic level, here's a few examples of that. The first would be if you have another architectural component. This could be your EMR. It could be a laboratory system, and you might have to be able to ask the architecture what code systems are available. Do you have SNOMED CT, ICD-10, and then you have a specific code you want to say. So of those code systems that are available, is this specific code 1234? Is that present? Is it valid? Is it part of that code system? Code translations, and you may have a code in the MOIC standard, or actually in a local standard. You've represented it in a proprietary format, and you want to translate that into MOIC or into a normalized data set. So that's code translations. And terminology services, one of their primary functions is to, other than publication of codes, is the publications of mapping. So you can define mappings between different code sets. And that's really, which allows you to do the code translations to normalize data. Value set queries, so is there a subset available for maternal health, or is there a specific value set for like lookup codes for a specific clinical form? And then value set resolution, which would be give me all of the codes that are part of a specific value set. And these are, like we said, at the most atomic level, and these are the building blocks of functions that you would have available in your architecture to do much more sophisticated types of workflows. And so as we started working with countries to implement terminology services, the first step is always to publish what are your standards within your country. And it didn't take long to learn that there were a lot of different challenges that implementers were facing, and that the types of challenges that we were seeing in lower and middle income countries were not necessarily the same as we were seeing in higher income countries. And even though there were some pretty sophisticated terminology service solutions available, they often weren't quite suited to the needs. And so we had to take a step back and try to understand, why is this the case? And so one of the primary observations is just that lower and middle income countries were at earlier stages in the adoption of standardized terminology throughout their health systems. And but the second is that existing terminology service solutions were primarily focused on more sophisticated use cases and around data exchange, and that some of the earlier steps that take place that really have to do with governance had not yet been addressed. And so we started to define a maturity model. This was created in collaboration with the OpenHIE Terminology Services subcommunity, and to define some of the different stages of maturity that countries and implementers are often going through as they move towards data exchange, but specifically for terminology services. So at the beginning, the nascent level, where you really don't have anything defined, but then you move into emerging, where your countries are starting to define at a national level the code sets that are being used for data collection, data reporting. And this often starts with diagnoses and with the national level indicators for an HMIS. And that the next step, though, of where you would have a shared electronic reference is that where there's a central authority where standards are published and available in standard formats, that this step tends to be a really significant step, not because of the technology, but because terminology is fundamentally it's a social challenge. It means a coordination across lots of different stakeholders to agree on not just what they should do, but to actually start rolling that out into use cases. And so the shared electronic reference is the beginning. That means you have transparency in what standards are needed in your country, and they are all available. The next step would be digital subscription, where architectural components can begin to subscribe to content, to update their local codes based on content that's been published centrally. And then the fifth stage is data exchange, where you're beginning to automate data exchange using a terminology service to support those workflows. And there are more other maturity models available that discuss terminology services, but all of them begin at the data exchange level and could walk through more sophisticated workflows for data exchange. And that would be very interesting to look at as you're starting to kind of grow your infrastructure. But like we said, most of the countries that we've been working with are beginning to establish a shared electronic reference, and are prototyping some of the more sophisticated types of workflows with digital subscription data exchange. And so just a few final observations of what we've learned along the way as we've been working with countries to implement data exchange or terminology services. And like we said, most countries are at the earlier stages of this. And one of the key obstacles to start is just access. How do I access all of the terminology standards that are available? And where do we start? Which one should we use? Do we want an interface terminology like CL? Should we use ICD-10 or 11 or LOINC? What about for procedures? There's not an easily accessible open standard for procedure codes. And given the number of vocabularies available, which use cases should we prioritize for adoption? It's a really important set of questions. And how do you prioritize this, and how do you get access to all of the content that's out there? The second is that just because you have access doesn't mean you have enough. It's that you really, like we said, it's a social challenge. It requires consensus across lots of stakeholders and coordination, which is governance around this. And governance for terminology is hard in all settings, including high resource settings. And for a number of reasons, and one of them is that it's not a one-time activity. You don't just publish all of the content and begin. Terminology standards are always evolving as best practices shift, and so you have to maintain your use of terminologies over time. And so this was where the Open Concept Lab emerged from, is kind of understanding the need for access, the need for better governance. And so we realized that better tools are needed to support the publication and use of the standard terminologies and low-income settings, to reduce the capacity required to support that maintenance and that use. And that while there are some solutions that exist, many of them were not adapted to lower resourced use cases and settings. And that also implementation of a local terminology service often isn't practical or even required for some of the use cases that implementers are beginning with. As you get more sophisticated and you have a high volume of transactions that are utilizing a terminology service, a local terminology service is an important part of your architecture. But until that time, it may be that a cloud-based solution that's a shared instance could be more than adequate. And it has the added benefit of allowing you to collaborate with the broader community. And where others are already publishing access to terminologies like ICD and LOINC, and are already beginning to publish national data dictionaries, and you can learn from or use starter sets for how others have approached it. So I want to shift now to Joe to provide, kind of go into the details for the Open Concept Lab and to provide a demo, but thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that introduction. So now that we've kind of touched upon what terminology services are and how they can benefit an e-health architecture, I want to talk a little bit about Open Concept Lab, which is a specific terminology service that has a few things that work really well for the low and middle income country setting. So OCL, as we call it for short, is an open source terminology management system that is aimed to help you collaboratively manage, publish, and use your terminology, your metadata, your definitions in the cloud with the global community. This tool is, as we said before, open source and recognized as a global good. Is cloud-based, where we have our OCL online hosted instance to get started quickly and easily. We intend to be community driven, and we're very active contributors to OpenHIE. We are standards based in that we are working with compliance towards FIRE R4 and the SVCM profile by IHE. And as we said, we've been focused on low and middle income countries where we have we're working with groups like OpenMRS, World Health Organization, and PEPFAR. OCL comes with an API that provides this real-time electronic access to terminology resources to make integration into your health information system more straightforward. So OCL itself consists of a toolkit with a few products. Namely, the terminology service is the backend REST API that is FHIR enabled, and this is what essentially hosts the terminology content itself. It's where you can access it and do specialized queries to get whatever information you're looking for out of it. Built on top of that is the OCL term browser, which we have a screenshot of that here at the bottom right, which is this customizable tool for searching, visualizing, and managing content in the OCL API. It's the user interface that helps newer users get started without having to understand REST queries or anything like that. Additionally, we do have an OpenMRS dictionary manager, which is a very specialized tool that does a lot of the same things that the OpenMRS the OCL term browser does, but it has a more specialized workflow for the OpenMRS workflow when managing clinical concept dictionaries. Around all of these tools, we have these tools hosted in an online instance called OCL Online. And this is where you can access these tools right away and start collaborating with the global community, plus start working with key terminologies like ICD-10 or LOINC or SNOMED GPS or CL. And yeah, that's where you would get started with OCL. So we've got just a couple of use cases for like, what will the Open Concept Lab do for you? Because this toolkit can help your organization to manage health data standards and get towards health information exchange. So just a few examples of the features that we can do. Searching, browsing, and comparing content helps you find your relevant terminology resources and start to perform your side-by-side depth comparison of your definitions. You can also publish your local codes. As we said earlier, loading and publishing your local codes allows you to begin mapping and also collaborating with the global community. You're able to, once you've published your own codes, you can map that data to reference vocabularies like ICD-10 and LOINC, which will then enable you to do the transformation of data using these structured concept maps. You're also able to build the value sets that you need, so you can start to drive data collection across your applications and systems. And as we've mentioned multiple times, it's a space where you can collaborate with a community, where you can reuse existing terminology content, whether that is reference terminologies like ICD-10, or whether that's more emerging standards like PEPFAR metadata or WHO SMART guidelines. So being able to reuse this terminology content and these concept dictionaries can help guide newer implementers. As we've mentioned a couple of times, OCL Online is the place where you can start collaborating on this terminology in the cloud. So OCL's tools are just that. They are software. They are pieces that you could implement on your own local architecture if needed. And we do have some countries who are doing just that. However, many, especially when they are getting started for the first time, they want a hosted instance where they can go ahead and get started with trying out the tools and with using terminology content that is already available. And that is what OCL Online does. In addition to that, we've got a community website and a blog where people can start to learn about terminology services and get connected with a community and things like that. And then when they are ready, they're able to access our hosted instances of our tools, our term browser and our terminology service and all that. Within OCL Online is this growing set of standard and local terminologies that are available for use, where you're able to map to this content or define your own value sets or whatever you would like to do. The kind of key goal with all this is reducing the barrier to adopting health data standards in your project by making this as easy as possible, where you can just access this tool online and right away get started with learning what you want to learn and seeing what else is out there that people can connect you with. As mentioned, we are publishing content on there that is key to global use cases. And we've got a few logos up here of just the key content that we have in there. We've got ICD-10, we've got LOINC for labs, we've got SNOMED's Global Patient Set or GPS. We've got emerging standards like from PEPFAR. We are the home of the CL interface terminology that is very much used in the OpenMRS space. Essentially, we're curating this content so that users are able to immediately access it and start using it without having to worry about keeping it up to date on their own local hosted instance. So with that, I actually just want to go ahead and jump into OCL itself. I think that we could do a very basic example for something that might be of interest. So the example that I'm going to do is that we're going to pretend like I'm building a form for some clinicians where they want to enter a patient's smoking status. So what I'm going to be looking for is putting together some diagnoses in a value set, which I can use in my medical record as a drop-down pick list for the clinician. We decided that CL, which I have shown here, is going to be the terminology of choice, and we are going to be focusing on smoker status. So let me just let me just search smoker in here real quick. And CL has about 17 terms for it. In this case, I'm going to be focusing on diagnoses in particular. And so with that, we've got the codes that CL has available. I am going to select smoker, former smoker, and then non-smoker. There is one more code that my value set is going to need that I don't see here. So I'm going to take what I already can get, smoker, former smoker, non-smoker. I'm going to add it into a collection that I have already preset for this demonstration. And we are going to add those concepts in there. So now that we've done that, we can go to the value set itself. I have already pinned it for this demonstration. And there we go. We've already started putting together a quick value set for the smoking diagnosis for CL. As I said, we've got these 3 codes, but there is one missing. Our value set requires smokers suspected. So I did not see that in the CL diagnoses list. So I decided that I'm going to make my own local code that is going to be added into this value set. And I already went ahead and created that before this meeting. So I'm basically going to add it in here now. We are going to search for smoker suspected. And in just one moment, we'll bring that up. While this is loading up, I will just say, oh, good, here it is. So I've searched for smoker suspected. This is the code that I myself have made. So I'm going to select that and add it into my value set. And it will refresh, and there we go. So we have now created a value set that combines standard terminologies where they are available, but also had added in some local content that is specific to our needs. And I might just point out that before this call, I also, in this custom concept that I made, did a mapping to a SNOMED GPS concept that I thought was going to be relevant for our use case. So if we do need to do some translation between my own local code and a standard terminology, then we do have a mapping in here for now. So this is the value set that we've made. We could integrate this into our medical record as part of a smoking status form. Some other things you might do in a demonstration like this, but we won't today. You might want to version control either the concepts themselves or this value set as a whole. You might want to create a version and release it to the world so that it can be used, but then you might over time make some changes that you want to stay tracked. And that's one thing that Open Concept Lab can also do is version control and being able to see what has changed over time. So with that, I'm going to jump back over to our slides. We've gone through this brief demonstration here. So now what I want to get into is a bit of a special topic for this call. We're going to talk about some implementation considerations with the terminology service. And this will get a bit into governance too, but we just want to talk about some things that we've learned when helping implementers get started with terminology and with terminology services. So this slide is a bit of a teaser. I will say that we won't be able to touch on these in too much detail. We could have a whole nother call on this entire topic, but if people would like to learn more, OpenHIE Academy does have a use and implementation course for terminology. I'll be sure to get these slides out to everybody so that you can access the links. So when you are implementing terminology, of course, collaboration is something that you might have in mind when you want to standardize and align with other organizations. And that part is great, but it's also not easy. You are often having to think about what stakeholders are involved, what environmental challenges might be there, and which systems would utilize the terminology service. And this is important because terminology uses do differ across systems. A lab information system might use LOINC for their terminology, where OpenMRS, which is a medical record system, might be needing an interface terminology like CL. And understanding which terminology would be selected and how you interact with other stakeholders is very important to do upfront. Additionally, you really need to be ready for change management in that many major standards and terminologies are constantly evolving. You might have done your mappings at one point, but they may become outdated. So eventually you will need to update to a later version of a terminology, more than likely. So you just want to be aware of changes and make sure that you can react accordingly. Keep your value sets, mappings up to date. And this is actually something a terminology service may be able to help with too, is this change management aspect. Additionally, if you are having to do local content, which ideally you are able to get all your needs met by a terminology, whether you are able to find all your codes that you need, or if you're able to ballot for new codes in that terminology. But there are sometimes going to be cases where you do need to make some of your own content. You might need to make and manage this local terminology that has some of your more edge case needs. So there are some challenges with this, whether it's figuring out who's responsible for addressing needs for new codes or who will be maintaining them over time. How will you manage the incorporation and release of new concepts, and many, many more challenges. But these are often steps that people need to consider when they start thinking about terminology. As John said, it's often not a technical issue, it's often a social issue. And so it's good to have these conversations and these plans up front. Specific to governance, we actually just pulled a little bit from the OpenHIE Terminology Services Guide, which I have linked down here at the bottom. As far as getting established with your governance, a good first step, of course, is that stakeholder leadership, where you start to establish the structure of your work and what kind of policy needs to be in place. And so structure, you might, just as a couple examples, you might have a centralized model versus a more decentralized model. So understanding that structure beforehand is a very good step. And policy, you might have different support from the law with national policies and things like that that can help enforce the implementation of this terminology in your country or in your area. Definitely big next step is establishing some key human resources. And we just listed some over here on the right side, where you're going to need people like a terminology service administrator. You're going to need chief terminologists who can understand and champion this terminology content. The software itself will need a custodian. The infrastructure in which your content is hosted will need an owner for that. And of course, you want subject matter experts that can get into their specific domains and provide that expertise for the rest of the terminology services team. Once you've established these human resources, then defining the scope is very important. Understanding what use cases and user stories will be supported by the terminology service. And once you have that established, then you can start talking about what terminology or terminologies are going to be required to support these initial use cases. So if you want to learn more, as I said, the terminology services planning and implementation guide is linked down here at the bottom. I did want to give a very quick use case to a country that we've been working with in the very recent months. Kenya has been working to standardize their concepts across their various OpenMRS implementations, with the kind of big challenge being that their limited local capacity as far as concept modeling, clinical knowledge, terminology management, and all that. They were wanting to have this central collaborative terminology service that is the source of truth for OpenMRS implementations in Kenya. So as of now, there is an OCL instance set up in Kenya, often called the NHDD, which has been set up and branded. And this is actually a screenshot that I have up here of their hosted instance. And that's something that they have started to publish terminology content on, whether that is ICD-10, whether that is their NHDD. So one thing that I wanted to highlight about the work that they've done is their governance approach, which is very cool to see this being played out. They have a very strong collaboration between the implementing groups like Palladium and Kenya's Ministry of Health. And they have been working to do some countrywide sensitization to the NHDD. And this includes both in the public sectors, but also in the private sectors, to make sure that their terminology content is respected and will be able to be used by across the country. They've actually established 3 core teams that own the work, one of which is the governance team, which is talking about managing terminology content across these implementations. There is a tooling team, which is actually setting up and maintaining OCL that will house the NHDD content. And then there's a capacity team, which is working on building partnerships and training users to adopt the NHDD and adopt the terminology service tooling. So with that, it looks like we've got about 20-ish minutes of discussion if we'd like to answer some questions. I also just linked some additional resources over here on the side if you would like to visit the website to try OCL, read about the blog, try out the app for yourself. We've got more details in a slide deck. We've also got a YouTube channel going to show some examples of how to get started with OCL, how to work with its API in term browser. And then, of course, we've got technical documentation. We've got an academy course and the other links that we've talked about in this presentation. So if people would like to start asking questions, either in the chat or raise your hand, however you would like to ask the question. I actually see that Boonshai has asked a question in the chat that could go ahead and get us kicked off. This is comparing and contrasting between OCL, Snowstorm, Apollon, Onto Server, Terminology Service, etc. John, do you want to take this, but I can support if needed?
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thanks so much for walking us through this. I think we also have somebody from Summit International on the call. We'd love to get some observations from reactions from two first, and then we could jump into the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Sir John and Sir Joe, for the presentation as well as the brief demonstration of the Open Lab. We also have Ms. Liara Totina from Snowmid International. Maybe Ms. Liara can share her insights with us, if any. We have also enabled the microphones. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I'd like to thank the presenters for very interesting presentation. From SNOMED perspective, as was mentioned during the talk, I'd like to encourage participants to consider using our free set, the global patient set, that can be utilized in tools such as shown here or others. There are other open source tools available as well. And that allows free access and exploring how terminologies can be utilized for particular use cases. And we can also discuss further opportunities for potential expansion of that if there's a need for particular governments to look into that.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Liara. Maybe we can proceed with the question of Dr. Bunchai, Sir John.
Sure. So Boonchai, I wanted to respond to your question about comparing and contrasting some of the different tools. I think it's a really good question, and as if an organization moving forward with implementation of terminology service, I think there's a lot of considerations that you want to think about. The first one is thinking about what are your initial workflows and what kind of volume are you expecting. OCL Online is what Joe presented, and it's hosted, cloud-based, and it supports FHIR operations. So you have FHIR resources such as code system value set concept map and the basic operations for each. So you could do validate code and expand, and others are being added. And so if you have a low volume of transactions and are testing out workflows in your architecture, or if your use case is primarily focused on management of terminologies and publication of them, OCL Online can be a really good option for you. And especially because a lot of vocabulary is already published, and you can more easily collaborate with the global community. However, as you start moving toward a higher volume of transactions or more sophisticated workflows, you're probably going to want to look at some of the other solutions that you could that are designed specifically to be deployed in your own architecture. OCL is you can do that. It's fully open source. You can put it in your own architecture, but it's not quite. It's more of a terminology management solution than it is a local high volume terminology service. And so some of the others that you listed there, like Amlung DTS, is a great option for that. Onto server, SNOMED Storm, and there's some solutions like that that are designed more around specific vocabularies. And the ICD-11 also has a local service for that too. So there are some specialized use cases like that that would be that you can take advantage of. What we would see as the ideal setup is, because OCL is designed more for that collaborative use case, if you're managing content in the cloud, then you could subscribe to it from your local terminology service for local deployment.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bunchai.
Hope that answers your question, Bunchai.
Yes, thank you, John. And actually, in AHIN countries, we are looking at the terminology services. And Alvin had mentioned about the OCL quite a lot, but we also, learning the snowstorm from the SNOMED City, and also working with the Cicero on the Onto server. And it's, to me, I think there is many variability of the implementation of the terminology services. And I think, like you said, it depends on how we're gonna architect our digital health in the countries.
Yes, in the meantime, Dr. Bunchai, maybe we can address the question of Dr. Alvin.
Yeah.
So the question reads, if a country joins SNOMED and uses a terminology server, can the country upload SNOMED to the TS by themselves, or can they be assisted by the OCL team?
So if you have a local instance of OCL, you could load that on your own. There is a bulk import feature. However, we do not have a SNOMED distribution for that. So that would be up to the implementer to prepare the import files on your own. OCL Online is planning to publish SNOMED CT and other reference vocabularies in the future, but we are also working through the licensing before we make those available. So in the meantime, like Joe mentioned, SNOMED GPS is available because that is made available without as an open license.
Thank you, John. As a follow-up question, John, we've had linkages with Onto Server, with OCL, and with Apton in our previous AHIN conferences and webinars. Are these terminology services interoperable, or is there like a common data format for a terminology service, or once you commit to one TS, then you have to stick with that TS? Over.
Yeah, great question. So in theory, they should be, because all three of the services you mentioned support FHIR, and FHIR could be used as a common data exchange format for, moving a code system between, or value set between these. However, FHIR is not really a great format for distribution of a full terminology, and it's a really inefficient way to do it. So each of the terminology services tend to have a different distribution format, even though they support FHIR, and those formats are not compatible. So I think the way that we, like I mentioned to Boon Chai's question about comparing the systems, what we would imagine that if you implemented Onto Server or DTS locally, we would like OCL to be compatible as a distribution or content syndication service for each of those, but that's not something that's currently implemented.
Thanks, John. And architecturally, would a country need only one OCL, or will it require several OCLs depending on, I guess, the size of the country or the geographic, how it divides itself up into geopolitical groups? What's your experience in Kenya? Is there only one instance, or will there be several instances? Over.
Yeah, thank you, Alvin. So Kenya has deployed a single instance of OCL, and their use case is a national health data dictionary, which, looking back at that maturity model, their initial goal is to support the publication of a shared electronic reference for standards used within the country. And that is one of the more common use cases for OCL. And we would recommend a single instance for that. And we're only seeing countries do a single deployment. The other terminology services are often implemented, within a single health delivery network or hospital, and there would be a good reason to have multiple instances of that, and where it's subscribing to a national health data dictionary to populate the terminology content in it. So I think there's a technical implementation question where you're trying to achieve a high level of performance that should be, what you're thinking about when you decide, do we need one or two, or should each network, each hospital have its own service or not? But but where are they getting the content from? And there should be something available centrally, that is that shared electronic reference. And that's more the use case OCL is designed for.
Thank you, Sir John. We also have a question from Sir Richard. Sir, maybe you can unmute your mic.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Jonathan, for the presentation. This was really fantastic. I've got a quick question, and I'm hoping that I don't know, I can get some advice from all the professionals in this call. And thanks, Joe. We actually had a brief introduction over email. I think it was about 2 days ago, actually, about the LOINC issue. So just taking it a little bit further, based on your response, but to the team, just for context, we are working with fire implementation guides, and we're using a Happy Fire server. And in this Happy Fire server, we're working with message bundles that also make use of the LOINC code system. The challenges this far, and I'm not sure if it's just a LOINC issue or perhaps a implementation bad practice that we've adopted so far that we just haven't noticed. But when we turn on validation in our fire implementation guide, whenever we use codes for LOINC, it always seems to fail. We get a very strange error, which doesn't really help much to help uncover what the issue really is. But so my real question is, is there a preferred practice on how to make use of a LOINC code system from within in a fire message bundle? I am aware of, if you wanted to make use of the REST API endpoints for LOINC, there's actual credentials that get assigned with that, and that works wonderfully. But I'm just not so sure it works like that really from a fire implementation point of view. And the other option is, of course, one could upload the latest LOINC code system to their Happy Fire server, to the terminology service. We haven't quite gotten that far yet. We've ran into some Happy CLI issues. We're still busy trying to figure out. But the larger question is there a preferred way of actually going about using LOINC code systems in Happy Fire? I hope that question sets the correct foundation, and I hope this is the correct forum for this. But yeah, please, any advice will be much appreciated. Thank you.
I don't have any experience to answer that. It seems like if I don't understand, if I understand correctly, it seems like the service at the Happy server and the fire and the terminology services inside Happy that acting strange or something like that. Actually, when we're talking about the fire and Happy server, we also have some question, but it seems like our forum is about the terminology server or service. I'm not quite sure. Michael, do you have any comments on Richard's questions?
Without knowing what the actual error message is that's coming back from the Happy server, it's very difficult to provide any sort of constructive help. And that the normal use of LOINC codes in Fire is you specify the code system with the appropriate URI for LOINC, which is http://loinc.org, and then you use the code in the code field. But beyond that, I without any detail on what the error coming back, even if it is difficult to decipher, I can't provide any additional help. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Well, Richard, we did go back and forth a little bit about this over email. If this is a more technical problem, I don't know if you've been on the Fire Zulip chat, but that may be a place to get started, just to be able to actually post the error codes and show exactly what you're going through, because I think some of what you're asking might be a technical question, and then some of what you're asking might be a what is the best approach moving forward question. And getting those spelled out on the Fire Zulip chat, we might be able to help a little bit more with some visuals, especially on the technical side.
Jonathan, I have a follow-up question about Kenya. Can I ask a question? Do you have any question from the chat? Okay. You said that OCL is maybe good for publishing, and then the centralized by data dictionary as Kenya implemented. My question is that the client or the user of these terminology service, it seems like the open MRS, which is implemented in Kenya. The question is that, are those open MRS is the same open MRS? Are they able to talking, or it's like different version and they cannot talk? We have to communicate with these publishing data dictionary, something like that.
Is the I think
Yeah.
maybe the question here is do the OpenMRS and OCL platforms talk to each other essentially? Are these compatible with each other? Is that kind of the question?
No. I think we know that it compatible,
Okay.
but OpenMRS, what I heard that even the Apex in different hospital, they cannot talk to each other. They maybe use the I don't know that they use the same. The software, the EMR software that working in the countries. Even they the same brand, the same software, the same product, but maybe implement differently. Is it the reason that the Kenya implement the open OCL? And not this only reason, but this is one of the reasons.
So yeah, this is definitely one of the reasons that they are implementing OCL, because they've had those troubles of these different implementations talking to each other, despite using the same OpenMRS they are all using OpenMRS, but these instances are actually pretty varied in their implementations and in their respective concept dictionaries. So there were several different implementations of OpenMRS across the different implementing groups. And so part of their goal has been to come together between these implementing groups, being driven by the Ministry of Health, to adopt this NHDD as the centralized concept dictionary. And with the goal being this data exchange and interoperability between different OpenMRS instances. So that is the goal they're getting at. But this is a very much in progress project at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bunchai and Sergio. I think that's the last question for tonight's session. Before we end our webinar, we would like to invite you again to another webinar next week. On November 14, we have a webinar with our friends from Dial on GovStack. And we also have upcoming webinars on OpenHIE as well. I think we still have 2 on OpenHIE. So I hope you can join us again in those sessions. We'll be sending updates on the final dates through our mailing list. So please tune in for that. Once again, thank you everyone, especially to our speakers, Sir John and Sergio. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone. Take
Night.
care.